Hi everyone, and welcome to this new video in which we continue our close reading of Dialectic of Enlightenment by Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. Today we continue reading from the last chapter, Notes and Sketches, and this time we're going to go through the notes that I think describe the kind of mentality spread through fascist regimes. So far we covered two aspects of the theory of fascism that Horkheimer is presenting in these notes, and we saw that it starts with a particular relationship between man and animals. The superiority of man over beast leads to superiority over nature, and from there superiority among humans themselves. Like man claims to be superior to women, white man superior to black man, the Aryan superior to the Jew. And so in the second video, so the video of last week, we've seen that this belief of superiority comes with a relationship with a mutilated body. Like Western civilization has an aversion towards bodies, humans are almost ashamed for having bodies, and this disconnection between the body and the mind is itself a mutilation. The individual, which is a union of the two, is cut into two parts, and one part having to hate the other. And so this in turn leads to the inhibition of cognitive faculties. The mind being cut off from the body becomes unable to think critically. And from this we talked about stupidity. So stupidity comes from this. We said last time that the authors view stupidity as a scar, as a mark of impotence, of weakness. And living in a world where weakness is an invitation to violence, like the weak are basically attracting the strong to inflict violence on them, so the weak must hide their weakness, otherwise they will be vulnerable. And so basically what this leads to is, basically you would have people who try to hide their stupidity. And so a theory of fascism of the kind that the authors saw in Nazi Germany and potentially close in the US, where the authors were living at that time, a theory of fascism must look at the mechanisms that people adopt in order to hide their stupidity and the consequences of those mechanisms. And one of the main mechanisms that we are going to talk about here is what they call knowingness. And it is something that comes from a society in which its members, having mutilated their bodies, are also isolated from one another. Like bodies being the means by which we feel each other's presence, the mutilation of bodies leads to loneliness, which then leads to stupidity. But this loneliness is also fostered by communication, by the media. Like paradoxically, the means to bring us together, communication, isolates us more. So these are the three main aspects that we are going to talk about here: knowingness, isolation, and the media. We start with knowingness, and so the first fragment is called Against Knowingness. Now, the background of Horkheimer in psychology basically explains everything that went wrong with Enlightenment. Freud famously said that the ego is not the master of his own home, and what that means is that the ego, the conscious part of consciousness, thinks that it is in charge of everything, that it is safe within its own home. But the powers of the unconscious, the hidden part of consciousness, are more running the show than the ego. The fact that the ego refuses to acknowledge this makes the unconscious even more powerful than it actually is. And so despite the warnings to the ego that the unconscious is right there, it is running the show and all of that, the ego doesn't listen and keeps having faith in its ability to be aware. And so the ego was giving all of its assurance by enlightenment. Enlightenment gave the tools for the ego to build this ultimate home in which it will be the ultimate master. So with numbers and mathematical formula, the ego believed that it can turn the whole world into a home where nothing can threaten his safety and, more importantly, his power. Like it claimed that it has control over the unconscious, like the ego claimed to have control over the unconscious, Enlightenment claimed that it cannot become its antithesis. And so the antithesis of Enlightenment is basically barbarism. So Enlightenment believes that it can never become barbarism because it believes in rationality, because it has it always trusts facts, studies, empirical evidence, and all of that. And so there is no reason to fear anything. And so knowledge will keep at bay the dictators, those manifestations of the id, the craving of power. And so as long as people are smart, meaning that they are enlightened, meaning that they are rational, they cannot be tempted by fascism. And so this is what Adorno and Horkheimer calls knowingness, which he also defines as the stupidity of cleverness. And in any case, according to the clever people, fascism was impossible in the West. Clever people have always made things easy for barbarians because they are so stupid. So what this is saying is anyone who believes that it is impossible for them to turn into their own antithesis because they are enlightened are setting up the stage for the next dictator. And so the paragraph targets both the well-informed expert who always, brings in his superiority as an expert, those who follow uncritically data and trust their intellect without seeming to realize that intellect has the potential to be barbarism. It is like true that they remind us that Hitler was an anti-intellectual. Like anti-intellectualism is the idea that intellectuals and experts are just a bunch of I-know-it-all pricks that think that their theories are all that matter in life, or that the most important thing in life are a matter of theories rather than intuition. So it would be misleading to say that fascism is the result of people listening to intellectuals, but as Horkheimer argues, despite the truth that Hitler was against intellect and humanity, the superiority of the well-informed is an intellect against humanity. And that kind of intellect was quite common in the West during the rise of fascism. Like the anti-intellectualism of Hitler was only possible because the well-informed intellectuals who were certain that fascism is impossible in the West. And so the well-informed intellectuals were thinking that fascism is just for primitive barbarians, not for the civilized, enlightened Europeans. So it is easier for a barbarian to be a leader in Europe than in any third world countries, because the European would never expect it to come from their side. They would always think that it will come from a parasite, from an outsider. And so an example of well-informed intellectuals are economists. And Horkheimer recalls a conversation with an economist saying, I recall a conversation with an economist who demonstrated the impossibility of Germany's militarization from the interests of Bavarian brewers. So Bavarian brewers, that's a reference to the beer hall putsch. It was a coup d'etat attempted by Hitler and other proto-Nazis, let's say, to overthrow the government in 1923. So 10 years before Hitler actually arrived to power. Because prior to that, Hitler already attempted a coup d'etat to overthrow the Weimar Republic. And the putsch started from beer halls in Munich. And Munich is situated in the state of Bavaria in southern Germany, and it is known for its beer halls. These are like big pubs where they serve mostly beer, and they work like French salons, where people socialize by talking about politics. So the Bavarian brewers mean those who make beer in Bavaria, and it happens that many of them were fascists. And so when the putsch happened and Hitler became a celebrity after his failed coup, some people like Adorno and Horkheimer are like, well, fascism is on the rise. But economists and well-informed intellectuals were like, well, these are just a minority. There is no way you will get a fascist army from the interests of Bavarian brewers. But it turned out that you can. And so in other words, knowingness is this belief that being an expert in a field guarantees a sort of security from becoming your antithesis, which in this case is ignorance, but also, fascism, barbarism, and etc. But as they say, it is the well-informed, far-sighted judgments, the prognosis based on statistics and experience, the observation which began, I happen to be an expert in this field. It is the well-founded, conclusive statements which are untrue. So what the most troubling thing about enlightenment is, it's that it is not aware of its own unconscious. Adorno and Horkheimer even say that many of these well-informed experts and intellectuals were Jews that dismissed the possibility of Hitler arriving to power, even though, as they say, it was clear as broad daylight. And so that is the stupidity of cleverness. To believe oneself to be clever means that we don't see the stupidity of our own actions and thoughts when we act stupid. It's, the ego that keeps denying the id. And so in the postscript of this fragment, Horkheimer argues that this stupidity arises when people believe that some rules will protect them. For example, they give how reasonableness is defined by Enlightenment. It means to be reasonable in the sense used by Chamberlain when he called Hitler's demands at Bad Godesberg unreasonable, means to insist that there be equivalence between giving and taking. Such reason is modeled on exchange. So the asterisk refers to the second meeting between Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of the UK from 37 to 1940, and Hitler in September 1938. So they met at Bad Godesberg. It's a borough in Bonn. That's in West Germany, and they met to discuss Hitler's plans to invade Czechoslovakia to get some lands that Hitler claims to belong to Germany. And so Chamberlain said that Hitler's demands were unreasonable, meaning that there is an unbalance between giving and taking. Like Hitler would take, but he won't give anything back. He won't give something equivalent back. And so this is the basis for the law of exchange, and it is the law of the market. What this means is that there has to be a medium between people in order for people to make agreements. You want to make an agreement with me, you need to give me something in return, something of, something equivalent in return. And so in this way, you can have the power to take something as long as you don't jeopardize the mediation of the market. So in other words, to be reasonable means that you go through the market, or you go through the mechanisms of the market to get what you want and not go and get it directly yourself. So the market will provide the context and conditions for your acquisition of something to be legitimate, and so that way the market will protect you from uncontrolled and unjust power. But as the authors say, this relies on the belief that power will play by the rules of the market. What would happen if someone disregarded those rules and gets directly what they want without the law of exchange? And so then the market will be powerless, like Chamberlain was in front of Hitler. Cleverness is helpless as soon as power disregards that rule and simply appropriates directly. The medium of traditional bourgeois intelligence discussion is in decline. Like when someone who has power can ignore your rules of exchange and steal the land or your merchandise, Horkheimer argues that the belief in mediation as a safeguard against fascism is a fantasy. So Enlightenment had this belief that through discussion we can solve issues. Like Chamberlain thought that he can reason with Hitler. He thinks that the fascists won't arrive to power because if they engage in discussion, they won't be able to convince anyone. And so in discussion, the bourgeoisie thinks that fascists need to be bound to a law of exchange and equivalence between give and take, giving their unreasonable positions. They will see that they are unbalanced and don't respect the rule of exchange, and so they will back off. As they say, a fascist does not like to be spoken to. When others have their say, he takes it as an impudent interruption. He is impervious to reason because he recognizes it only in concessions made by others. So yes, fascists are not respecting the law of exchange. To be spoken to means that you have to give to others their due, which means that you cannot be the only one talking, and so fascists just want to be the only one talking, the only one on stage. There is only talking, there is only taking, and never giving. But that's precisely the point. Like, fascism doesn't give a shit about discussion or about exchange or equivalence. It can only be stopped if it plays by the rules. But fascism doesn't play by the rules. It won't engage in conversation. And this is not a win for, for liberalism. It's not a win for enlightenment. The clever intellectuals think that the fascists cannot do anything once they are out of the public sphere. Once they cannot engage in discussion because it's in the public sphere that you engage in conversation. The law of exchange takes place in the public sphere. So you would think that if you throw away the fascist from the public sphere, well, the fascist won't have any power. But that is a fallacy. They think that as long as we don't hear the fascists, then there is no fascism. But the thing about fascism, about fascists, is precisely they don't shout, they act in silence. Their power precisely comes from silence. They're already outside of the public sphere, and that's how they get their power. Like, discussion and silence are antithesis to one another, meaning that they have a dialectical relationship. And so the problem with dialectical relation is that one cannot exist if the other doesn't exist. There cannot be discussions if there is no silence. So it's like, silence is itself within the exchange relationship. Okay, it's an exchange relation. For discussion to exist, it must make an exchange with silence, and therefore the raison d'être of discussion is also silence. But what would happen if people believed that silence is gone, that silence doesn't exist anymore or is just powerless? Well, then they will have no reason to discuss anymore. And so they will withdraw from the law of exchange between discussion and silence. The kind of law that precisely says that it is keeping power from going rogue. So not only the law of exchange would legitimize fascism, it also weakens the belief that it is supposed to keep it in check. So the belief in discussion came with a reassurance that made people think that silence, well, doesn't exist, or at least it is no threat, just a minority. It is outside of the public sphere. There is no reason to be afraid of it. And so Horkheimer puts it, even individuals can no longer converse and know it. That is why they have turned card games into a serious, responsible institution that calls on all their powers, so that although there are no conversations, the silence goes unheard. So knowingness led to a situation where no one is engaging in conversations, meaning that no one is engaging the fascists in conversations. No one is actually conversing with anyone. So it is like, people believe that discussions are happening somewhere out there. Politicians are taking care of everything. They are the ones discussing. We don't have to discuss ourselves, right? So discussions are like card games. They are not meant to be taken seriously in the sense of believing that they are actual ramparts against fascism. When you have that belief, you turn a card game into an institution, and then you would think that as long as the institution is there, then there is no silence. That fascism is impossible because we have these institutions. And so to take discussion seriously here means giving it such a power that it actually doesn't have, because the power isn't in discussion itself, but in people who must engage in it. It's like people took away their own responsibility and turned discussion into an institution and went like, now it's up for the institution to engage in conversations. And so the buildings of institutions can be empty. It will be enough for people to believe that they are protected from silence. Like you would just have an institution, but no one is actually there to, do the conversations. And so individuals thinking that they have their security guaranteed turn discussions into mere chit-chats. So they live their lives unaware that the silence is just growing. In short, no one hears the silence growing, even though there are no more conversations. And so once the institutions took on the responsibility to protect individuals, fascism grows without anyone noticing. And so the stupidity of cleverness is this idea that we managed to build a self-sustaining system based on the law of exchange. That system cannot turn into its antithesis. And so that sure demanded a lot of knowledge. We can be called clever for building such a system, but it led to the belief that the system of institutions will have the conversations for us. And so we no longer have to engage in anything anymore. We just relax and let the system run the show. And so there lies the stupidity. It led to a radical disempowerment of the individual. Now that the system runs the show, and it is believed to be an objective system because those who built it are so clever, we find ourselves having to accept everything that the system produces. We end up having no choice. The system is universal, so even when we see it deteriorate and destroy itself, we must also accept that. If the system is generating inequalities and social injustices, they have to be accepted because they were produced by a universally objective system. So all injustices end up being the results of the law of exchange. And hence the system itself finds its own way to justify inequality within equality, to justify partiality within impartiality. Quote, just as in an exchange, each party receives its due, but social injustices nevertheless results, the exchange economy's form of reflection, the prevalent rationality is just universal and particularistic, the instrument of privilege within equality. Fascism makes it pay the price. So fascism is therefore the silence that the belief in exchange economy and rationality ignores, and eventually it comes to stab it in the back. The law of exchange itself implies fascism that keeps, being ignored, and it keeps dwelling in silence until it grows powerful enough to show the real face of the system. Like the system is actually morphing into fascism. The law of exchange was fascism all along, and the chit-chat that replaced conversation were silence. And so fascism is the particular interest that comes back for revenge against this universalism. It is like the system claims to be universal and objective and equal, but in reality it just serves the interests of some particular groups. And so it is unreason that breaks the mask of reason and reveals what has been hidden beneath it all along. So unreason breaks through the mask of reason and shows that reason was just unreason. And so all laws of exchange end up being fascism. All universalism turns out to be the chaos of particular interests that now have taken a totalitarian form. We have no means of challenging it anyways, and whenever we try to, the well-informed expert will tell us that there is nothing to worry about. Cleverness reveals itself to be stupidity. So everything suffers the contradiction of stupid cleverness. And the fascists are perhaps the smartest and stupidest of them all. Like being the particularists that reject the universal, they automatically self-defeated themselves by claiming their particularism is not universal. If the fascist remains in the dark and operates in silence, if he doesn't go head-to-head in conversation, then it has indeed made the point of liberals. And so their particularism is just defenseless against universalism, and that's why they need to deny it. But then they have limited themselves to regress when they talk all the time about progress. The progress towards the new order has been carried largely by people whose consciousness progress has left behind bankrupts, sectarians, fools. They are exempt from error as long as their power precludes all competition. So in other words, the fascists are people who want progress towards the new order, but they want to use a consciousness that is not up to date, if you want. They use the progress of Enlightenment reason without its universalist claim, which is kind of impossible. You cannot have progress as understood by Enlightenment while claiming to be against universalism. Hence you end up with cheaters as carrier of progress. Their only way to avoid mistakes is by staying away from competition, which in Enlightenment means Enlightenment focuses mainly on the competition between ideas. But then when the fascist gets the power and arrive at the state, they now find themselves in a competition against other states. And in here, their mistakes becomes apparent since the fascists are, as we said, rely on intuition more than on intellect. The fascist is the student who doesn't study and goes to the test in a freestyle mode. And so answers are supposed to be arrived at through intuition. And so if he doesn't know the answers to the test, if the intuition lets him down, he will say that that's because the test isn't important. Like my intuition only works to reveal what is important in life. And so fascists are hardcore optimists who use rationality only as a decoy for their irrational tendencies. And so once they are heads of states, Horkheimer writes, we see how full of shit they are. The fascists, quote, with qualities such as myopia, bigotry, ignorance of economic forces, and above all, the inability to perceive the negative and include it in their assessment of the situation as a whole, are also impelled subjectively toward the catastrophe which in their hearts they have always expected. So fascists are actually the most individualistic of all individualists. They believe that there is nothing that can influence them, like they are so fucking special that they are the ego in the home called the world. They are above all kinds of forces, whether economic or even natural. And so they are so full of themselves that they prescribe a divine source for their own selves. Even their idea of fate and genetics isn't even conceived as an obstacle but a further proof of their own superiority. But in reality, they are just arrogant pricks who are not even aware of their arrogance. Fascists are therefore only running towards their own destruction. They are the best embodiment of enlightenment, a principle like a snake that simply eats its own tail. And so with knowingness, the ego simply lets the unconscious runs its course with even less restraints. towards self-annihilation. And so fascism is therefore the annihilation, the self-annihilation of enlightenment. And yes, it is paradoxical because the point of knowingness is to foster the image of the superego, right? People want to know because they want to cover their stupidity. It's for the sake of the ideal image that they make of themselves. So knowingness should be against an unconscious that goes wrong, that goes rogue. Yet, because it stems from the principle of self-preservation, what it actually seeks is to eliminate any obstacle, any threat to the unconscious, any competition. And so someone wants to be a tyrant, so he will act as if he doesn't until he has no enemies anymore, and thus he can rule on his own. And so the superego through knowingness is actually a strategy for the unconscious to reign supreme. It is Barbary with a human face. And what this basically means is that the ego wants to act like the unconscious. It wants power over others, but for that it needs to make itself absolute, to deny the existence of other minds, even if that means denying its own mind. And so this is where where the next fragment is significant, and it is called For Voltaire. Now, this fragment for Voltaire has two, it can have different meanings. It's either an apology for Voltaire, which will be pretty ironic once we go through it, or it can be a critique of Voltaire. There is a quote that is often attributed to Voltaire where he says, "I may disagree with what you say, but I will fight to the death for your right to say it." Now, obviously, it's a slogan for freedom of expression and freedom of speech. And it can be an attack on knowingness, since knowingness is one-sided. It is one-sided reason, which is what this fragment is going to talk about. So, for Voltaire can be a reminder of what Voltaire said, that we must listen to others, that we cannot have one-sided reason. But it can be ironic in the sense of, what if one-sided reason has to be heard? Like, should one-sided reason be tolerated? Should fascism or fascist thinking be tolerated? Because this is what it is about. The entry for Voltaire is an impression of how a fascist thinks. And so the first thing about fascism is one-sided reason accusing others of being one-sided. Your reason is one-sided, whispers one-sided reason, you have done power and injustice. So, concretely, this is a situation in which you have someone who criticizes power, like I explained to you everything that is bad about power, right? I do an excellent critique, I give sources, I used evidence, logical argumentation, everything that you want. I even added artistic and eloquent elements and all of that. And then you have an asshole who comes up and he's like, your critique is one-sided because I made a critique about what is wrong with power, but I didn't talk about the good things that power brought. I did an injustice to power because I only focused on the bad instead of the good. So they're like, without power, all the good things that you enjoy in life would be impossible. We all know the argument. Whenever you criticize something, its apologist would be like, it's thanks to that institution that you are even breathing or something. They say without the security which only power could establish, that good would never have come into being. Beneath the wings of power, life and love have played. Even your own happiness has been wrested from hostile nature by power. But the point that anti-fascists are making is that despite its accomplishments, power always sides with, well, power, never with powerless. Power, even if it makes someone's life better, it's always at the expense of someone else unjustly. Like, it always contributes to injustice and to oppression. And it's important to know that such injustices and oppressions are not necessary. Like, what makes it impossible for so-called power to make our lives better without murdering millions of people, without, oppressing countless people? Whenever the powerless are defended, they are defended only insofar as the power doesn't leave. But it is that same power that oppresses the powerless. So wanting to defend the powerless within the same structure that maintains the power that contributes to their oppression is the essence of one-sided reason. One-sided reason is not that we don't say the great things about power when we criticize it. It's the incapacity to conceive of a world in which power doesn't lead to mass murder or oppression. Indeed, one-sided reason cannot conceive of this. The logic is that power is represented by human beings, so if we criticize power, then we expose the people who represent that power. So our real target is those people. But getting rid of them won't solve anything according to one-sided reason, because they will be replaced by others, perhaps worse than them. And so, technically, that can be true. Sure, getting rid of the Nazis doesn't mean that they won't be replaced by worse people. But so what? Are we going to keep having Nazis because of some of their achievements, because we have Coco Chanel dresses and bags, and we are going to keep living under totalitarianism because of ignorance of the future? And so if that's true, then why didn't one-sided reason say the same about the Nazis before they get into power? Why didn't one-sided reason, for example, try to dissuade the Nazis from getting rid of the Weimar Republic? Because maybe what is coming next is worse, which it definitely was. And so the idea behind we have to talk about what is good about power didn't stop the Nazis from taking over the Weimar Republic, did it? I mean, why didn't the Nazis themselves admit that there is a lot of good in the Weimar Republic? So this idea of talking about the good, otherwise you are one-sided, is itself one-sided, since it seeks at legitimizing the existing power structures. Just because the power structures have some benefits, we must not speak badly of it, even if it's fascist murderers. But as the authors say, but even the alliance with the less brutal power does not imply that one should keep silent about infamies. So, especially when the infamies are of the scale of fascism and proto-fascism, clearly there has to be a sharp critique of it, and it cannot be left for those who represent it. Like, I'm not going to wait for Hitler or Goebbels to tell me what is wrong with fascism. So the chances that evil will get all the power if we don't denounce the injustices of a cause, no matter how good that cause can be, will always be greater than the chances of undermining the cause by denouncing its injustices. So even if talking about the bad regarding some cause is likely to undermine the cause, that's still better than taking the risk of letting those in power gain the sole privilege of talking about what is bad about the cause. And so that's what the authors mean by the likelihood that good causes might be damaged by denouncing the injustice which protects them from the devil has always been outweighed by the advantage of the devil gains if the denunciation of injustices is left solely to him. And so therefore critical theory is based on the conviction that its subject matter is never the good but the bad, because those who talk about the good are likely to justify all kinds of atrocities even for the smallest amount of good. Given the circumstances of the 20th century, whenever apologetics are on the rise, it's unreasonable to criticize them. Critical theory presupposes that there is some sort of order that's being repeated in society, and its only way for asserting its repetition is by being appealing. In other words, every apologetic language about a regime or a structure is sugarcoating and ideologically driven. It seeks to legitimize a suspicious ideology. And as such, it is, in Horkheimer's words, where language grows apologetic, it is already corrupted. By its nature, it can be neither neutral nor practical. So, what optimistic language tries to do is to defend an ideology. We already explained the views of the Frankfurt School regarding language, that language influences our thought and that it is through our language that we understand the world. By making language apologetic, we come to think of the world as good and just as it is. The social regimes want people to see them as only good things. That they are the best regimes that there is, and that they are only valid options for they are the only valid option for people who want to live. But apologetic language is more concerned with the sustaining of the social structure than addressing injustice and oppression. By doing that, it has already sided with tyranny against freedom and with lies instead of truth. And the point of Theory is, well, truth and freedom. There is only one expression for truth, the thought which repudiates injustice. If insistence on the good sides of life is not sublated in the negative whole, it transfigures its own opposites. It transfigures its own opposite, violence. Now that's an interesting sentence. If the good is not sublated in the negative whole, it becomes its opposite, it meaning violence. This is how people can lie while speaking the truth like the Nazis do. Like, it is true that power does have some benefits, but that praise turns into the most violent acts of all. And the point of theory is not to leave the scoundrels be the only ones who speak the truth. Sublating means integrating. If the good isn't integrated into the negative, then it becomes violence. If fascism sees that the good that is brought by power is integrated within its critique, power loses all justification. But this also applies to critique as well, because you can do a critique with apologetic language. Someone can, for example, be criticizing a certain order, but for the service of another order which is not criticized by that same person. And that's because that person isn't using language for the sake of truth. It is not doing it to repudiate injustice, but is using language as an instrument to justify a certain order, or other competing bureaucracies or rulers. So the fascist is someone whose language resembles the world he is defending. He doesn't leave room for his own language, in his own language, for its criticism. And so that's why Horkheimer, for Horkheimer, you cannot argue against the fascist using his own language because it's already apologetic. At best, you can just be criticizing his version for fascism, but fascism in itself is safe and sound. So fascism is the ideologies of lies, and there is no word that can be used by the lie. However, words remain about truth when they are used by the thought fighting against power. That struggle hardens thought, and in it, words keep their real temper. The language of truth resides in fighting against power, in resistance against injustice. So for Horkheimer, truth lies only in an uncompromised hatred against power, or more exactly against the terror that is inflicted on all of the earth's creatures, even the last one of them. And it is only through that hatred that the gratitude of those who are spared from that terror is earned. Like today, by fighting against the power that is, mass murdering Palestinians, by maintaining an uncompromised hatred against Israel and against Zionism, is how we earn the gratitude of those who survived the genocide. So as the authors end this entry for Voltaire, they say that it is not the sun that we should evoke, but the dry tree that is dying from the star's heat. It's not the sun that gives the beauty of the day, but the acknowledgement of the suffering that the tree is undergoing that will make us appreciate a day in which no one is thirsty. Quote, invocation of the sun is idolatry. Only the spectacle of the tree withered in its heat gives a presentiment of the majesty of the day, which will not scorch the world on which it shines. So in other words, even when you have a beautiful sunny day and you can spend hours describing how beautiful the sun is, if you met the plant that is being burned by the sun's heat, well, you are a fascist. And so this is what one-sided reason looks like. It wants to negate negation, or more exactly perhaps, it wants to ignore it. It doesn't want to admit contradictions in the world, but even within itself. Yet the word of fascism is full of contradictions. And so next fragment is going to be about a big contradiction, and it's called two worlds. So this contradiction is a contradiction within individualism. Like there is an individualistic contradiction that on the one hand, ideology claims that individuals are, individuals, that they are free to auto-determine themselves, but at the same time they are the product of the economy, of the economic, mechanisms. And this is best illustrated by the land of the free, America. In this country, there is no difference between a person and that person's economic fate. No one is anything other than his wealth, his income, his job, his prospects. So in America, there is a parallel between the economy and individuality, whereas, the American dream was sold as the opposite, that individuality would have no parallel and would not be determined by the economy. So the economic mask that people wear is transparent, but the idea that someone's worth is how much they earn how much they earn and earn how much they're worth should be alien to American ideology. So how to reconcile these two worlds, or more precisely, how can we explain these two worlds? So Horkheimer argues that this starts with the materialist critique of society that rejected idealism. Now, idealism was the belief that everything that is produced of the mind, that everything is the product of the mind, that reality exists as ideas. We explained it many times throughout the book, so no need to further develop it here, but it did have an advantage, and that is it posits that the individual is free from external factors. So idealism is appealing because precisely it argues that individuals create themselves independently of their economic backgrounds. So the being of individuals in idealism is determined by their own consciousness. Materialism, on the other hand, flips it over, and it argues that it is being, i.e. the materialistic conditions of existence, which isn't limited to the economy, but is also the physical world as well as cultures. It is this materialistic conditions of existence that determine consciousness. So reality is ideas, but concrete material is not ideas, but concrete material things, and our ideas are the result of those things. And so this often leads to what we call social determinism, the idea that mainly in this context, the economy determines who we are, how we perceive ourselves, and how we identify as individuals. So capitalism therefore makes individuals identify with their position in the capitalist economy. My consciousness, which means the basis of my individuality, is simply how much money I make, what kind of consumption goods I can afford, etc. And so they say people judge their own selves by their market value and find out who they are from how they fare in the capitalist economy. Their fare, however sad it may be, is for them not something external. They acknowledged it. And so this is important because it brings in some nuance. Horkheimer is saying that although materialism is a more accurate reading and understanding of reality, it doesn't entail determinism, because determinism, they argue, or more precisely fatalism, the idea that we are fated to be what we are, happens when we confuse the external factors with internal one. The fate of the Americans isn't viewed as something external, but as something that they internalize. I am a failure, says the American, and that is that. So materialism, in the Marxist tradition at least, says that you are your fate as a failure, but that is a result of a certain economic system that was socially constructed. It is external to you. The mask of failure isn't supposed to coincide with what is beneath it. And so if it were, then Marxism wouldn't be aiming at revolutions, right? So the two words that have been confused are the internal and the external, when in reality they should be separate. When they mingle, then being a failure becomes who we are, like we were just fated to be born this way, or we were just fated to be a failure. And so this fatalism is for Adorno and Horkheimer at the roots of fascism. The belief that we are what some sort of internal fate has decided to make us. It just turns us into nihilists who don't see the point of doing anything. We just complain that we are not lucky, that fortune didn't smile on us, instead of understanding that this is the doing of a system that can be deconstructed and overthrown. And so the best illustration for this is a poem that the authors quote from a German poet. And it's about the last words of a Chinese man leaving to go leading a solitary life in the mountains after he realized how unlucky he is. So a Chinese man, quote, spoke with tear-dimmed tones, "On me, my friend, the smile of the worldly fortune did not fall, and now I leave to wander mountain paths, seeking my heart's peace in their loneliness." So internalized fate leads to isolation from others. Feeling like we are destined to be unlucky and to be failures affects our self-worth to the point of not considering seeking support from our fellow human beings. And like the Chinese man, we are made to feel insignificant compared to the mountains that simply reflect our loneliness. And so we would rather go live in the mountain paths because, you know, we couldn't feel, you know, integrated or within human beings, so we feel like failures, so we go to a place of loneliness. We try to find a place where we can find peace in our loneliness. And so we arrive at the loneliness fragment, and how progressive means of communication under fascist ideology only foster this feeling of loneliness. And so the next fragment is called isolation by communication. So if there's anything to keep in mind here, is that, as they say, progress keeps people literally apart. So the progress of communication led to a paradoxical situation. The higher its increase, the greater the isolation in all spheres of society. Communication devices keep us apart through the crystallization of images in our brains. Devices such as radio, advertisement, and newspapers are one-sided. Like we said in previous videos about the radio, for example, you have only one person's message that is broadcasted to many with no possibility of response. So once one person communicates while the rest don't. They just, you know, receive it passively. And so the same is true with advertisement, where only one process of production is communicated and only one product is liked. At the time of Adorno, everyone loved only Pepsi Cola, for example. And so in movies too, you have this process. The image of the hero becomes the only model for adolescents and even for adults. So only one image is communicated. And so this, of course, leads to isolation, since no one can communicate with others. The images that are spread by the monopolies become barriers of what we want to communicate to others. When we have ideas in mind, we want to share them and debate them, but whenever we utter them, we see that they don't conform to the model imposed by monopolies. So unless we spread the same message communicated through mainstream devices, we are pushed into silence. And so, out of fear of being invisible, we'll take on the mantle of the mainstream. We are still invisible, of course, but at least the mantle can indicate that there is someone underneath it. So everything that can allow for genuine communication, which means that there may be more than one message walking around, is a threat to monopoly. So it puts in place measures to stifle even more the voices underneath the mantle, and it calls this progress. To have just one image being repeated everywhere is what the monopoly calls progress. And so the authors give the example of when people could still share meager secrets through whispering at the corner of a railroad station or the bank. But then progress comes in and creates open spaces, huge rooms in offices with glass walls, so that the supervisors can see everything going. And so small and private gatherings in which secrets can be shared are not even possible anymore. So putting surveillance cameras everywhere under the guise of progress and security is more about monitoring behaviors and locating dissident thoughts than genuine care for people's safety. So monopolies, even though the authors don't like the name, because, you know, monopolies are kind of, you know, Marxist terminologies, and we said that they wanted to have some distance with classical Marxism. But anyways, monopolies, they promote proximity. So the system creates platforms, giant rooms with glass walls, so that people can communicate, they can be close to one another, but only to make it easier for the system to identify the dissidents. So it counts also on the compliance of the collective to pressure the dissident voices into submitting to the crystallized ideas, because while it promotes proximity, it also isolates individuals physically, so that proximity will only reproduce the dominant ideology. It's like you train some dogs individually and then you bring them all together. They will all listen to their masters and behave accordingly. And it's also the perfect test to see if their conditioning has paid off. Likewise, we train people individually by isolating them, and then we put them together to test who needs more training, by which we mean who will have to go to jail. So all aspects of life are modeled on private and individualistic patterns. The example they give is how we moved from trains to cars, for example. Each person is driving in their own little car away from others in complete isolation. And as they say, what is talked about in one family automobile is the same as in another. In the nuclear family, conversation is regulated by practical interests. So power knows that given how people are being trained in their private nuclear families, they will behave accordingly in the collective. Each private sphere will be a reproduction of another. All private families are basically the same. All you hear is just the same voice. So the economy will regulate their interests so that they all model themselves on each other. And so this is the power of self-regulation of the market. The economy forces people into conformity, into adopting the same interest, the same idea, the same appearance, the same message, the same ideology, etc. So they will go to the same restaurants, shop at the same shops, talk about the same things, all regulated on the same price. So the knowledge of how much a household earns makes us confident in that they can in what they can afford, and from there we can know everything there is to know about them. Individuality doesn't threaten the system at all because it is neutralized in the statistic records. We know based on the statistic records of incomes, for example, what places you go to, what kind of movies you will watch, what music you will listen to, etc. And so communication forces people into becoming alike through forced isolation. Or as they say, communication makes people conform by isolating them. And so this is the consequence of knowingness, and it gets only worse. The isolation in question makes people forgettable. They become like ghosts, and it is important to talk about this. And this is why we're going to move to the next fragment, which is called a theory of ghosts. So the fascist mind has a strange relationship with death. Like we said, fascists are calling for their own ruins, so they are kind of like calling for their own death. They have, in Freudian terms, a death drive. To be brief, the death drive or the death principle is a theory developed by Freud after World War I. Freud used to believe in the pleasure principle, meaning that everything that drives us was seeking pleasure. But after the calamity of World War I, he said that maybe there is another principle that would explain why so many people threw their lives away in such a fucked up war. He argued that there is also this this drive that pushes us towards our own self-annihilation. But this isn't the only theory that Freud developed regarding our relationship with death. He also developed a theory regarding ghosts, which Horkheimer summarizes as follows. The belief in ghosts comes from the evil thoughts of the living about the dead, from the memory of old death wishes. So this theory means that people attribute evil powers to the dead because the dead become the manifestation of death drives. I have an old death wish, so I am going to attribute that wish to my deceased father or my deceased wife or friend, and they will come to haunt me. But it is my own death wish that is coming to me. But this theory of ghosts is too narrow, according to Horkheimer. First, he says the evil thoughts aren't that we give evil intentions to the dead, but are like it is like jealousy and guilt. When someone dies, we feel that they have abandoned us. They went to the afterlife or a state or to a state of not really nothingness, but a state of rest, as they write. It runs counter to consciousness to conceive of death as absolute nothingness. Absolute nothingness cannot be thought. And so we conceive of death as a better state than life. And so we resent the dead because we feel that they are the ones, that we are the ones left behind to carry the burden of life. And so we have a certain jealousy towards the dead because they are now resting, but they have left us behind. The belief in ghosts is the manifestation of that hatred or of that betrayal. When a loved one dies, we take it as a betrayal. If you lost someone, maybe you blame them or beg them not to leave, or whenever you go to visit their grave, you ask them, why did you have to go so soon? We also get a sense of guilt from there. We both feel guilty to be jealous of the dead. The jealousy can be a manifestation of the death drive, but in the sense that we want to be in the place of the dead. We want to be the ones who get away from the burden of life and finally be at peace and at rest. But what this entails isn't like what Freud thought, that ghosts are just some psychological manifestations of the unconscious, but are a manifestation of a belief which is, quote, at the stages of humanity's development when death still appeared as a direct continuation of life. So the belief is that death is a continuation of life. Those who die didn't completely disappear since, as we said, the mind cannot think of absolute nothingness. So when someone dies, they have to continue existing somehow and somewhere. Adorno and Horkheimer argue that this belief is still around in enlightened times, like when someone who just lost a close relative reorganized their whole life based on that loss, either through a cult of the deceased or through excessive rationalization of death or through spiritualism, for example. The desire of a continuation between life and death is still present despite the Enlightenment attacks on superstition. But the reason why this belief is persistent is because it has something valuable. It precisely resists nothingness, the state of annihilation. We want to maintain that relationship with the dead because it also reminds us that we will not accept or face annihilation. And we want to preserve the memories of those who passed away and also preserve them from annihilation. As they say, only when the horror of annihilation is raised fully into consciousness are we placed in the proper relationship to the dead, that of unity with them, since we, like them, are victims of the same conditions and of the same disappointed hope. But the fascist enterprise, with their unabated death wishes, sever this relationship with the dead. Fascism is precisely the annihilation of the individual, and it is something that Horkheimer is seeing more and more spread in his times. Despite the fact that the belief of continuation between life and death survives, the authors are skeptical regarding for how long it will survive. For them, individuality is now defined by its opposition, annihilation. By annihilation, they mean that the idea of a continuity in a person's history is now invalid. As we have severed the continuation between life and death, we did the same with even within life. There is no unity between life and death means also that there is no unity in an individual life, in the sequences of an individual life. The concept of human life itself as the unity of a person's history has become invalid. The individual's life is now defined merely by its opposite, annihilation, but has lost all concordance, all continuity between conscious remembrance and involuntary memory, meaning. Now, they say every individual is just a succession of present moments without any connection between them. We are no longer able to create meaning of our existence. Like we still remember stuff, like I remember events in my life, but that's the involuntary memory. It's memory like a computer memorizes stuff, but the computer doesn't ascribe any meaning to what it is memorizing, or at least like humans do. So meaning here means that my involuntary memory, like the faculty that my brain has of storing information, needs also to be accompanied with conscious remembrance. Like the things that I am storing needs to be actively integrated with another kind of memory, the memory of who I am as an individual. That is how I make my experience mine, as the experience of Smail Sherni. Without that, then all of my memories and experiences can be lived by anyone else. If we simply have the record of every single event in my life and we put them in a video projector, then the projector will become me, if we say that the individual is just involuntary memory. And so the ability to form meaning is therefore for Adorno and Horkheimer the guarantee of my subjectivity and therefore of my existence as an individual. It is this subjectivity that people want to preserve even for the dead. The belief in ghosts means the belief that means the belief in the trace of subjectivity. When individuals are reduced to just a succession of present moments, then they leave no trace when they are gone, which is what the fascist project is about. When I own a watch and then I die, the watch for the fascist must be nothing but a watch. There is no trace of subjectivity of its owner in it. It has no value whatsoever other than being a simple watch. And so the reason for this is because fascists consider the idea that the watch bear the trace of its owner as irrational, superfluous, and especially obsolete. Obsolete means out of date. It is something that refers to the past, which for the enlightened fascist is a time of stupidity, ignorance, and regress. So the fascist simply follows fashion. What is up to date is always taken for granted as true. So the fascist is someone who suffers from the inability of forming any healthy relationship with the past. So he only worships progress and sees nothing valuable that comes from the past. What is alarming is that this is perpetrated through all layers of society, in entertainment as well as in academia. As they write, just as any book which has not been published recently is suspect, just as the idea of history outside of specialized activities of the academic discipline makes up-to-date people nervous, the past of a human being makes them furious. So Enlightenment has therefore brought the idea that if it is new, then it must be true. Whereas everything suspected to be old, especially in knowledge, is immediately repudiated with suspicion. The world of the fascist is a world which doesn't believe in ancient wisdom. So the only times ancient wisdom is considered is if it has any utility for the new. And so the problem is that the new doesn't mean better. Just like those who follow fashion just take it for granted that what is released in their life must be better than what wasn't. And so this worship of the new therefore impacts our self-worth as individuals. We can only be considered valuable if we don't have a past, if we are up to date, if we follow fashion, which is meant that we have worth only as so far as we are useful to the demands of the present, regardless of the quality of those demands. So Adorno and Horkheimer bring in the issue of immigration, of how immigrants are always obliged to forget their past if they wish to be allowed in another country. They are told, in a well-meaning advice, of course, otherwise it won't be fun, to quote, that they should forget the past because it cannot be transplanted, that they should write off their prehistory and start an entire new life. And so, all of this is part of the ideology that makes people into useful tools for that same ideology. You are just forced to be hip, to buy the latest phone, to dress in the latest fashion, to talk about the latest news, to love the new celebrities, etc. You are forced to do it by you are forced to do it. It is for your own good somehow, according to the fascists. So the advice, as we said, is well-meaning. You have to be integrated into the social structure, otherwise you will commit social suicide. But the forceful integration into the cult of progress is presented as if it is for your own good, as if it is to protect you from annihilation. So people therefore will internalize this and do this violence to themselves out of fear of being socially disintegrated, which of course is ironic. People disintegrate themselves so that they protect themselves from disintegration. They are annihilating themselves so that they don't get annihilated. And so, as if the only way for them to remain relevant in society is to be marketable. So to be up to date, to answer the demands of the present, means that you have to have a market value. To be useful for the ideology means that we can make a profit out of you. And to go back to our subject of ghosts and dead people, if there is one aspect in our lives that resists marketing so much, it is mourning. Now, why is that? Well, because when you mourn, you are literally out of the market and out of society. When someone loses a loved one, they have the right to retreat from work, from social norms, etc. We won't ask of someone who is mourning to be on time at work or to put on a smiley face. So everyone understands that in mourning, people deserve to be cut some slack. And in that act of remembering the dead through mourning, the social pressure backs off. Mourning is like the blind spot of civilization where all social processes are suspended. So the unity between the living and the dead is an act of mourning. In an act of mourning operates like a sacred magical space as defined in the chapter on the concept of enlightenment. It is a sacred site from which the profane must stay away. So the profane here is progress. So social norms are that profanity, and the most profane of all is the market. In mourning, the market is reminded of its place, that it is highly inappropriate for it to try to invade that space or to give it a market value. So it doesn't mean that money cannot be involved. Of course, we can give money to someone who is mourning, and they can offer material possession, like they can, bury the material possession with the dead as part of the ritual of mourning. But that use of money is taken outside of market mechanisms. We didn't use it to make a profit, if you want. So in short, mourning is the stigma of civilization, as the authors write, and a social sentimentality which reveals that human beings have not yet been made to swear absolute allegiance to the realm of purposes. So mourning is an act that exists outside the realm of purposes, meaning that it doesn't have to have a purpose like anything else on the market. It is a sign that the individual still has a life outside of that realm, a life of meaning and of continuity. Therefore, the fascist ideology needs to appropriate mourning. If it cannot get rid of it, at least it can disfigure it. It can incorporate it. It can incorporate it within the social sentimentality. It does this by turning mourning into a social formality. For example, mourning more than all else is disfigured, deliberately turned into a social formality, which for the hardened survivors, the beautiful corpse has always been. So what this means is that the survivors, the people who have been left behind, the living, they must be hardened. They must remain stoic, or if they can't, they must be hidden. In patriarchal societies, the men attend to the funeral, in which they remain emotionless, while the woman would stay behind, for example, behind closed doors, while they can, mourn in tears. And so to show signs of emotional attachment to the dead is a sign of weakness, and therefore it is attributed to women, the social body that has no force over political matter. So mourning is giving to those who cannot break the social order, since their power was already taken away from them. So even in liberal societies, where men and women can attend the funeral and the procession, it is more expected from the woman to cry rather than the men. Adorno and Horkheimer give the example of a girl who saw her father shed a few tears during the funeral of her grandmother, and she said, quote, "A pity that daddy lost control." So the point is, even in the act of mourning, one must remain in control. And as they say a little bit before, in the funeral home and the crematorium, where the deceased are processed into transportable ashes, into a burdensome possession, it is indeed untimely to let oneself go. And so this, according to Horkheimer, indicates something very unsettling about ourselves in our relationship with the dead. To be forced to maintain control means that mourning is now under the control of social authority. What means is that we play the gender roles perfectly more than ever, and more than we care about the dead or the bereaved. So the father must not shed a tear no matter what. The collective has their eyes more on the behavior of each other. They are more concerned with the conduct of the living than with, paying attention to their relationship with the dead. So mourning becomes just a social tradition without meaning besides social control. The dead are therefore forgotten because no thoughts are given to them. I remember, by the way, that when my father died, my mother broke down because people kept coming. It's the social tradition, of course, and people come out of goodwill because they want to show their support and respect. But my mom, whenever the phone rings or someone is at the door, would cry and tell me, why can't they just leave me alone? And so that's because she is not giving the opportunity to mourn her husband properly, to pay attention to him, to have thoughts for him. And so the social process was interrupting her over and over again. Like anyone who is in a period of mourning, they just want to process in peace. They want their thoughts to go to the deceased and not to the social tradition. And likewise, the people who come to your house, they too care more about the social tradition than about the person mourning. I even remember that one time, this was still during the period of my mom's mourning. We went out to get groceries, and my grandmother was with us. So my dad's mom, and my mom, she put on a dress with flowers. It had motifs, it had flowers, and my grandmother told her that you are in a state of mourning. You shouldn't be wearing that. You should wear something black when you go outside, because people wouldn't like that. And so I thought of it as, again, this is someone who is privileging the social tradition, the social norm over the mourning of my dad. And so what this leads to is people never thinking about neither the dead nor the living. They all think about is did I play my role perfectly? But in doing so, they accepted their own annihilation, because their existence simply depends on their place in the social hierarchy and never about the thoughts that they have for themselves and others, and the thoughts others have about them. So in short, no one thinks of anyone else, and when no one is thought about by anyone, then no one exists. So we become like the dead in the old Jewish tradition mentioned by the authors. They say, the dead are in truth subjected to what for the ancient Jews was the most grievous curse, to thee shall no thoughts be turned. The living vent on the dead their despair, that they no longer give thoughts to themselves. So the fact that now the living are acting like the dead and regard one another as ghosts, as dead and gone, means that they don't care about one another. And without that care, the point of every action that we do is no longer to make things better for each other, but to maintain things as they are. And so this is where we get to propaganda. So the next fragment is called propaganda. So the project of Adorno and Horkheimer can be summarized in realizing what Marx said about philosophy. Its point is not to interpret the world, but to transform it. Marx argued that philosophers were simply describing how things are, or interpreting a status quo in order to legitimize it, when they should be doing the opposite. The role of philosophy is to break blind spots. When we believe that there is no path, philosophy reveals that there is a path. We think that it is impossible for people to live in equal and free societies. Philosophy says, no, it is possible. But the totalitarian system has invented ways to corrupt the philosophical enterprise, to turn Marx's affirmation into an interpretation. In other words, enlightenment can deceive us in making us think that we are transforming the world when we are just interpreting it. And so it does this through propaganda. Propaganda, according to Horkheimer, steers people towards a certain ideal. It promotes a certain vision of the world, and so it seems like it is transforming it. But as they write, propaganda directed at changing the world, what an absurdity. Propaganda turns language into an instrument, a lever, a machine. Propaganda fixes the composition which human beings have taken on under social injustice by steering them. So why is it an absurdity to say that propaganda is directed at changing the world? Well, because propaganda isn't transforming the world, but on the contrary, it is keeping it in its current form. It simply reinforces the status quo. The world promised by propaganda is the current one, which is, the same world that is producing the injustices from which propaganda promises to deliver us. So what it does is fix those injustices even more, and it continues to produce them. It fixes the composition which people have taken under injustices, means that it fixes the social hierarchies. The poor remains poor while the rich remain rich. So men remain more privileged than women, whites over black, Aryans over Jews, etc. So people simply remain in their place by being stirred into these categories. So propaganda even fixes these categories within the minds of people so that they steer themselves into the boxes through language. What propaganda does is it turns language into a machine. We already talked about how the culture industry instrumentalizes language, but to summarize, propaganda isn't limited to films and radios and racist stereotypes, but even in language. The language that we use is an instrument for propaganda, like we said, to fix even further the categories of social hierarchy. So whenever we speak, the image of the hierarchy comes more concrete in our heads, like we become more and more convinced of it. So propaganda turns language into a machine to steer us. A lever means that we can convince ourselves that we belong to a certain category. So language creates our own reality, like we said. So having a certain language will create a certain reality. So propaganda, by deciding which reality it wants, will also decide which language people should use. And so it needs people to be machines themselves, like they will automatically create the reality that propaganda is aiming at by using the language that propaganda decides or propaganda chooses. So with the language that propaganda chose for them, propaganda knows that it can count on the individuals to fulfill its schemes. So individuals themselves become propaganda. Each individual, through his words, through his body language, gestures, clothes, what he buys and consumes, etc., becomes an advertisement for the idea of the world, the ideal world of propaganda. We turn into media ourselves. So, but what Adorno and Horkheimer argue, that people know deep down that it's all bullshit. They know that they are being misled and lied to. The rage they feel in following it is the old rage against the yoke, reinforced by the dim knowledge that the way out pointed by propaganda is the wrong one. Propaganda manipulates human beings when it screams freedom, it contradicts itself. Mendacity is inseparable from it. So the yoke is when you put around is what you put around the neck of cattle to pull the plow. It's a symbol of slavery here, like cattle is forced into one direction to plow the earth for the interest of the farmer. People know that they share the same fate with propaganda. They know that they are being pulled, they are pulling a plow and into the wrong direction. But that knowledge that we are going in the wrong way is dim and easily manipulated, because propaganda is so good with mendacity, that means lies. It promises freedom while putting the yoke on people, but they can fall for it, because propaganda is purely pragmatic. The strength of propaganda lies in its ability to make both the ruler and the ruled agree. Normally these two shouldn't agree with one another, or even with their status as ruler and ruled. None should believe that the hierarchy is real or even true. If they do, then they will both see their interest as compatible, when in reality the interest of the ruler and those of the ruled are antagonistic to each other. But propaganda makes it seem as if we all have the same interests, like it is in the interests of the ruled to be ruled by the ruler. And so even when they seem antagonistic, like for example the buyer and the seller, the former wants to keep as much money as he can, while the latter wants to take as much as he can. So these two may seem in tension, but they both have the same interest, self-preservation. They both agree on how the world is presented to them, a struggle to take as much as you can from the other. Hence, propaganda, even when its content can be true, it remains within a community of lies. Even when the interests of the ruler and the ruled are in tension, propaganda finds a way to turn that tension into a lie, because its goal isn't the truth, but to get more adherents. It needs the ruler and the ruled to adhere to its project, and therefore it will force both of their interests into a harmonious whole. In it, even truth becomes a mere means to the end of gaining adherence. It falsifies truth simply by taking it into its mouth. So basically it says that as soon as propaganda says something true, it turns into a lie. Language loses all of its substance, all of its meaning here. Antonyms become synonyms. If you want them to, words are nothing more than forms in which we can put whatever we want, and so the meaning of words is therefore decided by propaganda. And as such, propaganda is anti-human as well. It deprives humans of what precisely makes them human. They are turned into simple instruments for their own domination. And so language, which is the invention of human beings to free themselves, to explore the world, to understand it, to imagine, and to dream, has turned into its opposite. It enslaves humans into hierarchical worldviews. It prevents them from exploring the world. It keeps them ignorant and afraid to imagine and dream, at the cost of being called naive, stupid, or childish. So as they write, this is why true resistance is without propaganda. Propaganda is anti-human. It presupposes that the principle that politics should spring from communal insight is no more than a form of words. So communal insight means thinking collectively. It presupposes kinship and connection among human beings, but those connections must be real. They must have concrete content. Propaganda, however, tells us that we have those connections in the form of words. When you listen to a politician saying, we must make efforts together and stick together, while that politician is embracing policies that have the direct consequences of keeping us apart. That is propaganda. So the communal insight isn't in the existence of a real community of real bonds, but in the empty words of politicians. Politics then become a simple matter of rhetoric, of how to conceive people of a reality that doesn't even exist. So Adorno and Horkheimer come to the conclusion that a free world is a world without propaganda, and therefore without advertisement. They encourage us to be distrustful of everything that is recommended for everyone. And so the more you recommend something, the more you presuppose that everything will find their interest in it, which means that you will just lie about it. What needs advertisement for the authors is bullshit. Advertisement and propaganda increase when the thing or the worldview they promote decrease in quality. As they say, it's the Volkswagen that needs advertisement, not the Rolls-Royce. And so what needs to be promoted is always the cheap, the replaceable, the dispensable, and that is what we ourselves must be. If we too are advertisement, then it means that we are cheap, replaceable, and dispensable. So resistance means not to give in to the industry's products, to political speeches, and especially to advertisement. What we need to do is remember that our interests do not harmonize with the industry, no matter how much it tries to prove it, even when it tries to offer something. So even when what is offered is real freedom, like the institutions who promote freedom are talking about real freedom, like for example, Stalinist Russia or capitalist America, even when they are aiming at true freedom for all, if they promote freedom through propaganda, it turns into what we know about, Stalinist Russia and the land of the free. Quote, even propaganda for freedom can be a source of confusion in that it necessarily effaces the difference between theory and the particular interests of its addressees. So, since we don't have the same particular interests, a propaganda for freedom will only create confusion. People have different notions of freedom. What freedom means for the proletariat isn't the same for the capitalist. So a propaganda of freedom will inevitably make it seem as if the two have the same interest or the same conception of freedom. And so what is unsettling about it is that while propaganda makes us believe that we have the same interests as those who are in different positions within the hierarchy, it makes us believe that we don't have the same interest with those with whom we share similar interests. In a radical way, Adorno gives the example of how fascism turned intellectuals and work, how it treated intellectuals and workers. The Nazis were anti-Marxists, and they killed every working class leader they could put their hands on. And their propaganda effort is so efficient that the truth of the actions of the workers' leaders are quickly forgotten. So propaganda has its way of belying solidarity between the workers and their leaders. It's like when you turn a revolutionary into a terrorist, and that way you deprive the people of forming any bond of solidarity between them and with their revolutionary leaders. And so, propaganda makes it so that every time you have people who try to unionize and to organize, it will it will turn them all into competitors. And so even when you have the same interest, the propaganda will say, no, you don't have the same interest as the people you try to unionize with. Each one of you has to only fed for himself. So when the leaders and intellectuals are tortured into the concentration camps, the workers don't feel that they lost something valuable. They are not worse off knowing that they lost a leader. And as such, they don't expect fascism, they don't experience fascism in the same way as intellectuals. As a writer, fascism was not the same for Ossietzky and for the proletariat. Propaganda cheated both. So Ossietzky was a German journalist who died in 1938 after being tortured in a concentration camp by the Nazis for exposing the secret and clandestine armament of Germany. And as you know, after Germany lost World War I, the Treaty of Versailles said that Germany cannot have any army anymore, but the Nazis were militarizing the country secretly. And Ossietzky exposed that, and so he was accused of treason and thrown into a camp. And all he got was the Nobel Peace Prize in 1935, but he couldn't go to Norway to get it. But the proletariat didn't really care. They felt no affinity with Ossietzky, and there was no solidarity between them, and so they didn't experience fascism in the same way. And so they were both cheated by propaganda. Their solidarity was undermined, and instead the working class were told that their interests lie with the Nazis. So propaganda, in other words, makes you identify with your enemy. It turns the enemy into a friend and the friend into an enemy. It's basically, when you would have a woman who would develop a Stockholm syndrome. Basically that's basically it. So therefore, Adorno and Horkheimer are skeptical of any propaganda, no matter what its content may be. The content of propaganda can be an active call to break free from hell. Like, propaganda doesn't mean that we are depicting society as hell. It is not pessimism, but optimism. It is the repeating belief that we can break free from hell served as a routine. And so the hope for a better future cannot be addressed to the masses or the individual, because both are powerless in front of propaganda. To promise a heaven out of hell to those who are powerless in hell is the best way to keep people in hell. So you make them reliant not on intellectuals exposing the bullshit, but on those who chain them in hell. So propaganda is like the powerful telling you to trust them, to let them maneuver everything, and you will see somehow everything will be perfect. If things don't turn out to be perfect, it's because of a traitor of someone like Ossietzky. And so it just turns people into helpless and passive conformists, and they will soon or later forget that hope. And hence Adorno and Horkheimer say that the invitation to break from hell mustn't be addressed to those who are in hell, but rather to an imaginary witness who is already outside of hell. This is the principle of hope, if you want. If that invitation can be addressed to anyone today, it is neither to the so-called masses nor to the individual who is powerless, but rather to an imaginary witness to whom we bequeath it, so that it is not entirely lost with us. So it's like a poetic image to say that each one of us must imagine what it would be like to live outside of hell. You know, to imagine a witness outside of hell and to address that witness. And so that imaginary witness will keep that hope until we get there. Basically, we have to keep imagining ways out of hell, not just, you know, making promises out of hell, but to have concrete imaginative ways out, alternatives. And so this is a call for the importance of imagination and breaking out of our needs for constant reassurance. The fact that we have to rely on an imaginary witness means that it's time to break from the present apparatus. There is nothing here that can help us. Enlightenment has reached a dead end, and it's time we take a giant leap of faith and venture to where nothing has yet been tried. So propaganda insists on keeping us in the world as it is, and it tells us that even to break from hell, we must do it with the means of hell. We can only have equality within social hierarchy. Like the damn hierarchy has to stay, like Peterson says. So Adorno and Horkheimer are saying no, the damn hierarchy must go, and when we enter that new uncharted world, the only thing we have to guide us is imagination. But what can imagination do when it itself is being stripped of its power? Imagination needs real people, real individuals, not the kind of individuals promoted by propaganda or by the media, the kind of people that only promote pseudo-individuality. In other words, celebrities. Okay, that's the last thing that we need. And so we are going to talk about celebrities in the next fragment, which is called Mass Society. The cult of stars and celebrities is a fascist phenomenon because it turns what stands out into a standardized production. There's an idea regarding celebrities, which is that they are not regular people. Regular means replaceable, without distinctive traits in their individuality. The celebrity, by contrast, is the individual who is not like everybody else. They have their own uniqueness and appeal. Celebrities are embodiment of difference. They are literally like stars. They are so far removed from the ordinary and the mundane that they feel like they are coming from another world. And when we compare them to the stars, we see how far the stars are from one another in the night sky. It is like each star remains untouched and unaffected by the other stars. So it has its own individuality. And so the cult of stars is therefore the cult of individuality. But individuality becomes the opium of the mass society. Through this cult, mass society is produced. Mass society is the opposite of individuality. It is a big giant pile of goo in which you can distinguish nothing. It's all sameness. So how does a society that worships individualism, individuality, this much ends up being a society of sameness, a mass society? So for Horkheimer, complementing the cult of stars is the social mechanisms for the notables, which levels anything that stands out. The stars and dignitaries are mere patterns for the ready-made world, and for the scissors of juridical and economic justice, which snip off the last loose ends. So what does this mean? Well, the notables are people who are important, the VIPs of society. And since they form social groups, they have their own social mechanisms. Their groups have a certain functioning which allows them to sustain their social position. So the cult of stars isn't a celebration of difference and of the emancipatory potential of high culture. Rather, it is the way for the notables to maintain their social domination over others and even impose that social domination on themselves. They turn themselves into the standards needed for their group to sustain itself. So the cult of stars levels anything that stands out, means that it makes the same everything. It makes, the same everything that is different. Today we can think of the Kardashians as the ultimate example of this. They are celebrated for being stars, yet they are all the same. To be a star requires a certain worldview, a certain behavior, a certain ideology, which fucks over the outsiders of the group. It's all about conformism, all about the prestige, and never asking about the cost of that prestige. So the notables aren't just entertainment stars, but anyone who is considered important. Dignitaries are part of it. Those are high-ranked officials, generals or ministers, judges, presidents. All are dignitaries. and what they are, it's patterns for the ready-made world. They are stereotypes of how you must be if you want to be different. And so the absurdity of fascism is that you have people who look alike, who tell you how different they are and how to be different. And it's by becoming like them, economically, physically, mentally, and even politically speaking. And based on this absurdity, they become also the pattern, the model for justice. So the notables aren't just the models for the ready-made world to follow, they are not just, a model for the masses, but even for justice, both juridical and economical. Juridical justice means the state, so anyone who fails to be different on the model of the stars is basically a criminal. And in economic justice, whomever fails to be different is rendered economically insignificant. So ending your life poor is your own choice for not being as unique and flawless as Kim. So the cult of the stars is a pattern for the scissors of justice that last loose ends, meaning that it severs solidarity between people. Criminals and poor are like that because of their own choice and action. They are responsible of their own fate and they deserve to be left behind. No one should concern themselves with them. Wanting to be a star means that you are light years away from your fellow stars. In short, the cult of stars criminalizes compassion and empathy. That is why in the postscript of the note, they make a parallel between, on the one hand, the standardization and leveling of people in general. We're on the same level because we're all standardized. Because we're all standardized, we are all the same, which again, don't confuse this with being equal. Now, don't confuse sameness with equality. So on the one hand, you have standardization of people, and on the other, you have the hyper-individuality of the fascist leader. Like the stars, they're presented as if they are supermen, as if they are something special, and they have something special about them rather than what they are in reality. In reality, they are functions of their own publicity apparatus, intersections of the identical reactions of countless people. So the leaders as individuals, the leader as an individual doesn't exist, or the Superman is only super because he exists. He's not a function in an apparatus. The fascist leader, like the celebrity, has no existence. He exists only as a fiction created by the impotence of the masses. The leader is a mass psychological projection of the collective. We are in a system that is making us important and passive. We are being standardized into sameness, and so that produces a lot of frustration that can turn into either a revolution or a fantasy about some people managing to break free from the system and maintaining their individuality. So in other words, we can either reclaim our individuality or see its fetishized version in fucked up people, like when the child sees in his father the free, complete individual who gets things done. So the fascist leader, however, isn't the father but the collective. He is the monstrously enlarged projection of the impotent ego of each individual. So the leader becomes the representation of the impotent masses, and the person wearing the costume, making the speeches and the gestures, is just an actor. Like leaders, as Adorno and Horkheimer say, are actors playing leaders. The man Adolf Hitler is as powerless as the rest of the masses, but he embodies power on the behalf of the masses. He is just a blank space, an empty vase that power occupies at that moment. Hitler himself, like all fascist leaders and celebrities, have no individuality. They are empty shells filled with the power created by the resentment of the masses. It's like in ghost stories where someone dies but they have unfinished business, which includes, revenge, and so they go on and possess someone to get their revenge. So the fascist leader is a random dude who happens to be possessed by the ghost of the masses who are fed up with their conditions. But instead of rising against the system, their hatred was embodied in a vessel that works for the system. So leaders literally are decayed individualism. they are the corpses of individualism. The masses are individuals in decay, and that decay possesses the leaders, which reward the decay by giving it reality TV for entertainment. Whether you watch the Kardashians or Hitler's speeches, what you are is a decaying individual watching the fantasy of individualism. So in Adorno's time and in Horkheimer's time, it was whether you listen to the speeches of Bismarck or Hitler. Bismarck was the Chancellor of Germany from 1871 to 1890. He was known as the Iron Chancellor because of a speech he gave in 1862 about how Germany must be unified through blood and iron. Like, it's not by liberalism but by power that you unify Germany. But he was mostly a diplomat and only occasionally resorted to war. So he'd be like the antithesis to Hitler, but as Horkheimer writes, the distance between the individuality of Bismarck and of Hitler is hardly less than that between the prose of Gedanken und Erinnerungen, not sure the pronunciation, and the gibberish of Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf, I think, yeah, I can't pronounce that correctly. So, like, the individuality of Bismarck isn't really that different from Hitler's, since the latter is actually a fuller version of the bourgeois individualism embodied in the former. The Gedanken und Erinnerungen is it's actually the name of the autobiography of Bismarck. It means thoughts and memoirs. They say that the authors say that there is no big difference between the autobiography of Bismarck and that of Hitler. But the main point is that these figures don't really exist, but are just actors playing the role of the masses' fantasies. In reality, the Kardashians are as insignificant as the average Joe, like Hitler is the same as any impotent individual in mass society. So Adorno and Horkheimer refer to Charlie Chaplin's film, The Great Dictator. Now, in that movie, Chaplin plays two roles, that of a Jewish ghetto barber and of Hinkel. Now, who's Hinkel? Well, he is a parody of Hitler. And because both of them look alike, the army of the dictator mistake them. Like, they mistake Hinkel for the barber and the barber for Hinkel. And so the point of Adorno and Horkheimer is that the leader's power lies in the fact that the masses don't see how insignificant the leaders truly are. And therefore, to fight against fascism means revealing what the leader and celebrity are in reality. As they say, in the struggle against fascism, not the least concern is to reduce the bloated leader images to the true scale of their insignificance. So, once we realize that this has been just a fantasy from the start, then according to Adorno and Horkheimer, we can begin to be aware of our freedom. But to come out of this, we need to break from mass society. Okay, we need to do so. We need to do so quickly, but in order to do so, we need to break from the knowingness syndrome. So the most critical aspect of knowingness is in what way it creates mass society, and it does it through contagion. Knowingness can spread easily because it is basically making copies of itself and of others. The point of knowingness is how fast and easy it can be replicated. It has an avalanche effect, which is the title of the next and last fragment. So the knowingness syndrome creates an avalanche of effect on society. The content of knowingness spreads like an epidemic. The facts are reproduced throughout society, or more precisely, within the social and political sphere. Like politicians, experts and journalists spread certain ideas taken to be true official knowledge through communication. The radio and the newspaper communicate to everyone the same fact. From household to household, they repeat the same event. But the repetition comes with an unsettling realization. The repetition of events indicates a stagnation in events, meaning that there are no turning points anymore. Adorno and Horkheimer define a turning point, a turn of event, as knowing something for the better. So the lack of it means that there is no better anymore. We have already, reached the peak, and therefore the only way from there is a way down. And so for this reason, The events communicated by the media are always events about signs of decadence. Media is gossip, like when people want to spill the tea about their friends and neighbors. It's often in a negative note. They like to point to how their neighbors don't have their shit together and spreading rumors about others. In short, knowingness results in moral panics. We condemn individual behaviors for the decadence of society. We condemn a lack of virtues as a reason for why we are either stagnating or regressing. Kind of like right now in Tunisia, you have these TV programs about drug addiction in young adults and teenagers. It's framed as a lack of virtue, it's a personal behavior problem, and so communication programs isolate us from one another by insisting that everything that is wrong with society is a result of personal behavior and attitude. A social problem doesn't require collective assistance, but specific individuals to fix themselves. Until they cure themselves, there is no point in helping or caring. But soon the facts turn from vulgar rumors to existential threats. People read the headlines about, rearmament, tension in the Mediterranean, wars about to break out, etc. And so the public becomes infected with a growing fear and uncontrollable terror that we are at the end of civilization. And so from people judging alehouse swagger, this is the example that Adorno and Horkheimer use, probably to mean party people, we go to uncontrollable fear, which of course is genuine given the breakout of World War I and the inflation after the crash of 1928, and then World War I, the sequel. But fear only heightens the fascist ideology that led to those events in the first place. So the events that happened were an avalanche of growing fear. It is the same fear, according to the authors, that led to the growing votes to Hitler. When the fear of some led to a growth in the votes for the most fascist candidate, everyone else starts mimicking that behavior. So the scared few that voted for Hitler soon start infecting others who are afraid too by the same events. They've been reading the newspapers, or at least the few voting Hitler won't be stopped by the many who don't because they're crippling fear. As they write, if 10 or 20 districts turn en masse in a certain direction, the remaining 100 will not oppose them. Already a uniform mentality exists. So this reality of how much people are under the influence of avalanche phenomenon makes Adorno and Horkheimer skeptical about the future of democracies. With the rise of Nazi Germany and the breakout of World War II, they argue that, of course, everyone must fight fascism with all of their might. But we also need to be aware of how that fascist ideology even came to power in the first place. So Nazism is an ideology that grew through xenophobic, anti-cultural and collectivist sentiment. Fascism is fueled by a fear against the other, which is fueled by its hatred towards culture. It sees culture as a negation of power, as some sort of intellectual superior morality and pretension. But the devaluation of culture, as we already explained in the culture industry, meant the suppression of the individual. Culture for Adorno and Horkheimer serves as an emancipatory tool for the individuals. Without it, the individual becomes completely vulnerable to the collective's emotional fears and is overwhelmed by them. He disappears into the sea of crowds. He becomes just one statistic among others. So being a statistic means that all we retain of your existence is a number. Your life experience, your past, your identity, your character, none of them remains. So you are only what the statistics say you are. Hence the phrase, the essence of the word coincides with the statistical law by which its surface is classified. So, being deprived of the means to be free and to assert oneself, nations fall into fascism. That's why fascism isn't just Nazism or Stalinism or Mussolini or Franco's Italy and Spain, but also the United States, France, England, Canada, and all the nations that don't see these characteristics growing within their population. As a writer, when all is over, a spirit of freedom need not spread across Europe. Its nations may become as xenophobic, as hostile to culture, and as pseudo and collectivistic pseudo-collectivists, as the fascism against which they had to defend themselves. Even its defeat will not necessarily break the motion of the avalanche. So pseudo-collectivist means that it looks like a collective when in reality it's not. Like collective actions are needed and praised in Adorno and Horkheimer, but a collective is only real when the members of the collective are real individuals. So a pseudo-collective is an aggregation of pseudo-individuals, and we explained pseudo-individuality many times already. So the giveaway is any nation that thinks of itself as democratic or not fascist, but crushes its individuals or keeps them apart with growing fear, which devaluates culture and expresses xenophobic views, is inherently fascist. And it's just a matter of time before the next Hitler comes in. So living together and accepting one another was supposed to be the principle of liberal societies, but it is now being replaced by its opposite. Quote, the fundamental principle of liberal philosophy was that of both/and. Today the principle of either/or seems to apply, but in such a way to the decision has already been taken for the worse. So a principle that is inclusive, both and, from that principle we get to a principle that is exclusive, either or. So the latter is the principle of ultimatums, either fascism or death. The principle of either or is a principle of fear and terror, and we will explore more how terror and fear operate under fascism next time. All right, so that's it for today. Thank you for watching. As always, hopefully that this is helpful and helps you understand these concepts and these difficult works. And next time we are going to talk about terror, how it is implemented, and how what are the characteristics of terror under fascist regimes. And hopefully I will